Picture an empty room, no one in it, nothing moving. The camera just holds on the space. A hallway, a kitchen, a corner of a room you thought you knew, and you feel it, that prickling at the base of your skull, that irrational, absolutely certain conviction that something is there, something watching, something breathing just outside your frame of vision. That's what Leigh Whannell figured out, that the most terrifying version of an invisible man isn't the one you see, it's the one you don't. And the moment he locked onto that idea, everything else about this film followed naturally. The Invisible Man, released on February 28, 2020, is one of the most precise horror films of the past decade. Precise is the right word. Not big, not loud, not crammed with CGI spectacle. Precise. So let's back up. Way back, the Dark Universe disaster in 2017, Universal Pictures was dreaming big, really big. They'd watched Marvel build an empire with interconnected superhero films, and they wanted a piece of that format for themselves. The plan? The Dark Universe was quietly dismantled before it ever really got started. Universal stepped back, took a breath, and started rethinking their approach to these properties. What emerged from that rethink was a decision that, in retrospect, looks like genius. Hand these monster stories to smaller, more agile filmmakers working on leaner budgets with actual creative freedom. Don't force interconnectivity. Don't build toward crossover events. Just let talented directors make films about these characters and see what happens. The producer who made that approach work was Jason Blum. Blumhouse takes over. Jason Blum has one of the most interesting careers in modern Hollywood. His company, Blumhouse Productions, operates on a model that the rest of the industry has tried to imitate and mostly failed at. Keep budgets extremely low, sometimes absurdly low, give directors enormous creative control, and take a bigger share of the profits when the films hit. The results speak for themselves. Paranormal Activity, The Purge, Insidious, Get Out, Happy Death Day, Split. Film after film made for a fraction of what major studios spend, returning many multiples of their investment. When Universal approached Bloom about rebooting the classic monster properties under this philosophy, he was interested. And when it came to The Invisible Man specifically, Bloom had an instinct about who should make it. Leigh Whannell. Now if you know horror, you know Whannell's name. He co-wrote Saw with James Wan back in 2004. That first film, remember, made for 1.2 million and became one of the most influential horror movies in decades. He wrote and directed Insidious, Chapter 3. He co-wrote the first 3 Insidious films. But the project that put him on the shortlist for this kind of reinvention was 2018's Upgrade, a science fiction action horror hybrid that he wrote and directed, made for roughly 3 million and which quietly blew critics away with its ingenuity. Upgrade is a film about a paralyzed man who receives a sentient AI implant that can control his body, and it's the kind of lean, smart, brutal genre cinema that demonstrates not just technical competence but genuine authorial voice. Whannell knew how to do a lot with a little. More importantly, he knew how to make the audience feel something. So Blumhouse brought him in on The Invisible Man. And what Whannell did first, the decision that determined everything else, was throw out the original premise entirely. The conceptual flip. The classic Invisible Man story, whether you're talking about the H.G. Wells novel or the beloved 1933 Universal film with Claude Rains, follows the Invisible Man himself. He is the protagonist. The story is his story. His experiments, his descent into madness, his rampage, we are inside his head tracking his experience. Whannell's idea was to invert that completely. What if, instead of centering the story on the person who is invisible, you told it entirely from the perspective of the person being haunted by them? Think about what that does. Immediately, the invisible figure becomes pure threat. You are not inside his psychology, humanizing him, watching his point of view. You are on the other side of his gaze, vulnerable, watched, hunted. And more than that, you can't prove it. Nobody can. Because if the person hunting you is invisible, then from everyone else's perspective, you're just a frightened, unstable woman claiming to be stalked by a dead man. That's not just a clever narrative inversion. It's a story about gaslighting, about domestic abuse, about the specific terror of being in a situation that is absolutely real to you and completely unverifiable to anyone else. One of the things I like the most about this movie, Elisabeth Moss said in a joint interview with Whannell ahead of the film's release, is that it's a real life monster. That's what really curdles your blood when you watch the movie. She wasn't talking about the invisibility suit. She was talking about the kind of man who would use power. Any kind of power to make a woman doubt her own mind. This is what the film is fundamentally about. Not technology, not science fiction, not a monster in the classic universal sense. It's about control. And specifically, the kind of control that operates by making its victim appear crazy. Casting the center. Once Whannell had this conceptual framework, the casting became obvious in hindsight. But it was still a specific and inspired choice. Elisabeth Moss. Moss had spent years, by 2019, building one of the most impressive portfolios of any actress working in prestige television and independent film. Her Emmy win for Mad Men, where she played Peggy Olson across 7 seasons with extraordinary depth and subtlety, established her as an actor capable of communicating enormous inner complexity with minimal external expression. Her Golden Globe nominated work on The Handmaid's Tale, a role that demanded she sustain narrative tension and character interiority across multiple seasons, demonstrated she could carry a story entirely on her shoulders, even when the script constrained what her character could do or say outright. For The Invisible Man, both of those qualities were essential. Cecilia Kass, the character Moss would play, needed to be someone the audience believes instantly and completely, because the entire film depends on you being on her side, seeing what she sees, feeling what she feels. If you don't trust Cecilia's perception of reality in the first 15 minutes, the film falls apart. He had already made the decision to center the film on Cecilia rather than Adrian, but the specifics of how an abuse survivor experiences the world, the hypervigilance, the self doubt, the way normal situations feel loaded with threat were refined through conversations with Moss. The result is a film that doesn't just intellectually argue that gaslighting is terrifying. The locations have a specific quality, contemporary, upscale, slightly sterile, beautiful in a way that feels faintly inhospitable. The kind of spaces where control and wealth make themselves felt in every surface. The budget, as mentioned, was 7 million. That's a number worth sitting with for a second because it shapes every creative decision in the film. With 7 million, you can't build massive set pieces. You can't afford extended action sequences with dozens of stunt performers. You have to be surgical. You have to commit to what you can do well and ruthlessly cut everything else. Whannell and his cinematographer Stefan Duccio made the budget a feature rather than a limitation. They built a film around negative space, around what you don't see, around the psychological implications of an empty frame. The constraint became the concept. Composer Benjamin Wallfisch, who had worked on it 2007 and Blade Runner 2009, created a score that functions almost like a second camera, a set of frequencies and tones that communicate danger and unease without narrating it. We'll spend a full section on how the sound design works in detail later, but it's worth noting here that for a film about something invisible, sound is doing an enormous amount of the heavy lifting. Release, COVID, and the box office story. The Invisible Man opened on February 28, 2020. Its opening weekend was 28.2 million, a genuinely impressive number for a film of this scale and genre, and one that had industry observers reaching for comparisons with Jordan Peele's Get Out, which had opened just under 3 years earlier with 33.4 million. The comparison wasn't idle flattery. By the second week of March, theaters were operating under shadow. By March 12th, the film's daily gross had plummeted from thousands of dollars per screen to hundreds. By March 17th, it was pulling in 98,000 nationally. And then the theaters shut. Universal, responding to the unprecedented situation, made The Invisible Man available for premium video on demand rental, 1999, just 3 weeks after its theatrical debut. The decision was controversial at the time, but ultimately correct. It allowed audiences to see the film during lockdown and extended its cultural conversation at precisely the moment when people were stuck at home looking for something smart to watch. The final worldwide gross was approximately 144.5 million. The consensus was immediate. This was a serious genre film, not a cheap horror product. Critics praised Warner's direction for its spatial intelligence, its patience, and its willingness to let scenes breathe rather than cut to cheap scares. Moss's performance was consistently singled out as the core of the film's effectiveness. a portrait of trauma and determination that felt genuinely grounded rather than just functional. The film also sparked a cultural conversation that went beyond typical horror discourse because The Invisible Man is explicitly, deliberately, without apology, a film about domestic abuse and the specific horror of gaslighting. It arrived in a moment when that conversation was very much alive in the culture. The Me Too movement had been reshaping public discourse since 2017. But because of what it withholds, let's start at the beginning. The film opens without a word of dialogue. That choice alone tells you everything about what kind of filmmaker Leigh Whannell is and what kind of film you are about to watch. There's no expository voiceover, no title card establishing context, no character talking to someone on the phone to casually explain their situation. The film just begins, in the dark, with a woman lying in bed next to a sleeping man, and the immediate, overwhelming impression is that she is terrified. Watch Elisabeth Moss in these first minutes. Really watch her. She's barely moving. Her breathing is controlled, deliberate, the kind of measured breath you take when you're trying not to make a sound, when you've learned that any movement might wake something dangerous. Her eyes are open in the dark, tracking, calculating, and the camera is already doing something you'll come to recognize as the film's signature move. It's holding on Cecilia with the same stillness she's performing, as if the frame itself is holding its breath with her. She has a plan, a precise, premeditated plan that clearly took significant preparation. She's through the front door, past the alarm, and she's moving toward the car, and then the cat sees her. The cat, a white and fluffy presence named Zeus, begins meowing loudly enough to be heard indoors. And in that moment, Moss's face does something extraordinary, pure, cold terror, not surprise. Terror, the kind that comes from the body before the conscious mind catches up. She doesn't freeze the way you freeze when something startles you. She freezes the way you freeze when you know exactly what the consequences of being caught would be. That cat is a brilliant piece of screenwriting. It does three things simultaneously. It injects immediate practical danger into the escape. It tells you without explanation that Cecilia's fear of this man is absolute and not hypothetical. And it sets up Zeus as a recurring presence in the film, the one witness who will later observe things that Cecilia cannot prove. She makes it to the car. Refuge that doesn't feel like safety. James Lanier, played by Aldis Hodge, is a police officer and an old friend of Cecilia's. His house is the structural and aesthetic opposite of Adrian's clifftop fortress, warm, lived in, full of the specific comfortable chaos of a single parent raising a teenage daughter. His daughter, Sydney Storm Reed, doing quiet, watchful work throughout, is the kind of kid who's clearly bright and slightly skeptical, observing adults with that particular 17-year-old mixture of perception and judgment. Cecilia is, at this point, functionally broken. She won't go outside. She sits in the kitchen of James's house and doesn't move toward the front door. She barely speaks. When she does speak, she's careful, clipped, answering questions without expanding, not because she's rude, but because she's still in survival mode. Every answer she gives feels like it's been run through a filter. Is this safe to say? Is this safe to share? This is Moss's performance working at its most subtle. She's playing a woman who has been so thoroughly conditioned to monitor her own expression, her own words, her own reactions around a controlling man that the habit persists even in a safe environment. She can't switch it off. The hypervigilance is baked in now. It's muscle memory. It's a very specific kind of suspended disbelief, the way you feel when something seems too good to be true. She doesn't exhale. She doesn't cry with relief or pump her fist or collapse. She goes quiet in a different way, a suspicious way. And that reaction, that controlled, almost mistrustful response to news that should free her, is the film's first real thesis statement. This woman knows this man. She knows what he's capable of. And she doesn't believe for a second that something as simple and untidy as death would stop him. Meeting Adrian, the backstory the film refuses to show. Here's something. The Invisible Man does that most Hollywood films would never have the nerve to do. It doesn't show you the relationship. We get no flashbacks to Cecilia and Adrian happy together. No montage of them in love. No tender early days to contextualize the darkness that followed. The film trusts you to understand abuse without needing to narratively justify it first. Without the implicit suggestion that the good times were worth remembering. Without the romantic softening that so often makes audiences uncomfortable about fully condemning an abusive partner. What we get instead is fragments. Cecilia mentioning, almost in passing, that Adrian controlled everything: what she ate, who she saw, what she wore, what work she took. We get the physical layout of that house, which already told us the story. We get her body's involuntary reactions. The flinch when a car backfires, the way she scans exits when she enters a room, the manner in which she holds herself as if always braced for impact. These fragments build Adrian in negative space, the kind that lives entirely in the patterns it creates in another person's nervous system. Oliver Jackson-Cohen, for his part, makes this work in the few moments we do see Adrian's face. There's a quality to his physicality that's immediately uncomfortably precise. The way he stands, the way he occupies space, projects the casual certainty of a man who has never been told no in a way he's had to accept. He's handsome in a way that probably translated to charming at some earlier point in the relationship. He is not overtly threatening. He is polished and professionally smooth, delivering news the way lawyers do, with warmth calibrated to the specific legal implications of what he is communicating. Adrian, Tom explains, has left Cecilia a significant sum, $5 million, to be received in installments on one condition. Immediately, her claim is suspect even to people who love her. Not because they don't care, but because the financial incentive she'd be forfeiting by making the claim introduces a rational counter-narrative. Wouldn't it be convenient for her to not be crazy? And then the counter narrative. But she has every incentive to stay sane. If she says she's being stopped, she loses everything. Adrian built this clause deliberately. He knew Cecilia well enough to predict exactly how the money would work as a psychological trap. If she talks about what's happening, she loses the safety net. If she doesn't talk, she's isolated and disbelieved. Either way, she's controlled. Whannell plants this detail with minimal fuss and then lets it sit, compounding quietly in the background across the entire rest of the film. It's architecture, the kind of careful dramatic construction that pays dividends 20, 30, 40 minutes later. The empty frame. Let's pause on the visual language here because it's established in the first act and it underpins every scene in the film. Stefan Duccio's cinematography operates on a specific principle: the camera cannot be trusted. More precisely, the visible frame cannot be trusted to contain everything that matters. Throughout the film, Whannell and Duccio repeatedly direct the camera to pan slowly away from Cecilia, sometimes mid-conversation, mid-action, to hold on an empty room, an empty corner, an apparently vacant hallway. No one is there, or no one visible is there. The effect is immediate and profound. Once you've seen the camera do this 2 or 3 times, you stop trusting any empty frame. Every shot that lingers on negative space becomes charged with threat. Your eye starts scanning the edges, looking for a disturbance in the air, a hair slightly out of place, a shadow that falls at the wrong angle. You're doing exactly what Cecilia is doing. You're hunting for proof of something you can feel but can't see. This is a genuinely clever extension of the horror concept into the visual grammar of the film. Invisibility isn't just a plot mechanic, it's a challenge to the medium itself. Cinema works by showing you things. This film is about something that refuses to be shown, and so the form and the content are in constant productive tension with each other. Every empty frame is an argument about the limits of what you can know by looking. There's a specific shot early in the first act, Cecilia alone in the kitchen of James's house at night, getting a glass of water, where the camera slowly pans to an empty staircase and holds there for what feels like 5 seconds too long. Nothing happens. But by the time Whannell cuts back to Cecilia, you're already certain. And that certainty, arrived at before you even have evidence, is the film's great achievement. It's making you gaslit too. Sydney and the college application. One of the threads running through the first act that's easy to undervalue but becomes crucial later is Cecilia's relationship with Sydney. They form a quiet, respectful friendship built partly on the mutual acknowledgement that they are both navigating difficult circumstances. Sydney is applying to architecture school and worried about whether she is good enough. Cecilia, who was an architect before Adrian systematically dismantled her career, recognizes something of herself in this kid. The mentorship that develops between them has two functions in the script. First, it gives Cecilia a reason to re-engage with the world. Helping Sydney with her application portfolio forces her out of the total passivity of her trauma response and reconnects her to the professional identity that Adrian stripped away. Second, It establishes Sydney as someone Cecilia cares about fiercely, which sets up the devastating second act sequence where that relationship is used as a weapon against her. Whannell structures his characters this way throughout. Every warmth, every connection, everything Cecilia loves or values becomes, in the second act, a vector for Adrian's cruelty. The first sign, the inciting incident, the moment the film shifts from woman in hiding to woman being actively hunted, is perfectly staged. Cecilia is in the shower. She goes to wash her face and her shower gel disappears from her hand, just vanishes. She stares at her empty palm, looks around. The bottle is capped and sitting on the shelf. She stands in the shower with the water hitting her, trying to process what just happened. Did she imagine it? Did she drop it without noticing? Is she? And this is the question Adrian designed his plan to make inevitable, losing her mind. It's such a simple thing, a missing shower bottle, and the terror it generates is entirely out of proportion to its physical insignificance, which is exactly the point. The horror of this film doesn't operate through dramatic, undeniable supernatural events that force everyone to accept what's happening. It operates through small, deniable, almost embarrassing incidents that accumulate until the person experiencing them starts to question their own sanity. That questioning is the real weapon, not the invisible suit, not the physical threat, the erosion of Cecilia's trust in her own perception. That's what Adrian is actually after. Because a woman who doesn't trust what she sees, what she feels, what she knows, a woman like that is manageable, controllable, right back in the cage, even without walls. The film has been building to this moment since the opening frame, and now that it's here, there's no going back. There's a word for what happens in the second act of The Invisible Man, and it isn't haunting. Haunting implies something passive, a ghost in the corner, a chill in the room, a presence that disturbs without intent. What Adrian Griffin does to Cecilia Kass is not passive, it is systematic, it is targeted. And what Whannell understands, what makes this section of the film so genuinely uncomfortable to watch, is that the escalation doesn't just frighten Cecilia, it isolates her. Every incident that she can't explain to herself becomes an incident she can't explain to anyone else. And the people around her, loving and well meaning, respond the way rational people do when a frightened friend starts describing experiences that don't square with observable reality. They worry, they tread carefully, they start to wonder. This is the second act's real architecture, not a horror film about an invisible man, but a study in how isolation compounds fear and how fear begins to look from the outside, exactly like instability. The attic, the first fully committed scare of the second act, comes from a place most horror films would use as a cheap set piece, the attic. Cecilia hears something, a storage box that might have shifted. She stands in the silence with the flashlight, and the film holds on her face while she processes the gap between what she felt, that absolute, bone deep certainty of her presence, and what the space is showing her, which is nothing. The dust disturbance is the key detail. It's there, it's real, turns it back, doesn't mention it. This is another masterclass in what the film refuses to do. A lesser version of this story would have Cecilia immediately rush to James and describe every incident in sequence, forcing the drama of his skepticism. Instead, Whannell has her absorb these events quietly, building a private log of experiences she's not yet ready to share. Because she knows, and this knowledge comes directly from her experience of being controlled, that the moment you report something like a turned painting, the conversation shifts from what happened to "are you okay?" And she cannot afford to have that conversation yet, she cannot afford to be seen as not okay, so she stays quiet, and the incidents continue. Her keys moved, a cup relocated on the kitchen counter. Small violations of the physical order of her space, each one individually dismissible, collectively forming a pattern that she is certain of and can prove to no one. This is Adrian's design. He knows her well enough to understand that these small disturbances will terrify her more than anything dramatic, because she's the only one who'll feel them, which means she's the only one who'll be frightened. And a woman who is frightened alone is a woman who begins to seem frightened of nothing. The coffee shop, and Emily Cecilia takes a step toward the outside world, tentative, enormous for her, when she agrees to meet her sister Emily for coffee. It's a significant moment. She hasn't left James's house in weeks. The act of getting dressed, walking out the front door, sitting in a public space without walls between her and the street. It's a reclamation of ordinary life, and Moss plays the exposure of it beautifully. Cecilia sits in the coffee shop with the slightly wide eyes of someone relearning how to be a person in the world, and then something cold lands in her lap. Cecilia suddenly pulls back from the table, startled. Something touched her, moved against her, and there's nothing there. She looks around. The coffee shop is busy, normal. Emily is watching her with that careful, loving expression that's already starting to carry an edge of worry. Cecilia tries to explain what happened and can't, because how do you explain that something invisible just touched you in a crowded coffee shop? Emily is a character worth spending time on here, because Harriet Dyer does something really specific with her that the film depends on. Emily loves her sister. That's not in question, and Dyer never plays it with any ambivalence. But Emily is also, by temperament, a practical and grounded person. The kind of person whose care expresses itself through problem solving, through finding rational explanations, through gently steering someone she loves toward help when the explanations stop being rational. Her concern for Cecilia comes entirely from love, and it becomes, through no fault of Emily's own, one of Adrian's most effective tools. Because every time Emily's face does that careful, worried thing, that expression that says, I believe you're frightened, and I don't quite believe what you're frightened of, it costs Cecilia something. Another small withdrawal from the account of self trust. Another confirmation that her experience of reality is diverging from everyone else's. The investigative turn to her credit. Cecilia doesn't just absorb these events passively, she starts investigating. This is one of the things the script does well, that a lot of films about gaslit protagonists get wrong. It makes Cecilia active. She's not a passive victim waiting to be rescued or believed. She is a woman using her intelligence, her professional expertise, and her knowledge of Adrian to try to understand what's happening to her and build a case. The film respects her agency even while depicting her systematic disempowerment. She starts researching optic camouflage, the field Adrian worked in. She pulls up academic papers, patent filings, technical documentation on light bending materials, and what she finds, piece by piece, is that the technology she'd need for what she suspects, a suit that renders the wearer completely invisible, is not science fiction. It's engineering. It's at the edge of what's currently possible, but it's not impossible. And Adrian, described throughout as a genius level optical engineer, would have been exactly the kind of person to push past that edge. This sequence is narratively important because it does two things simultaneously. First, it validates Cecilia's suspicion within the logic of the film's world. This isn't her being irrational, she is following the evidence to a coherent conclusion. Second, it deepens the tragedy of her situation because proof of technical possibility is not proof of personal application. She can demonstrate that such a suit could exist. She cannot demonstrate that Adrian built one and is wearing it in James's house. The gap between those two things is where the film lives, and it's an unbridgeable gap by design. Adrian's body and Tom's story. Cecilia also, around this time, pushes Tom for details about Adrian's death. The official story is that Adrian killed himself, found in the bathtub, alone, cause of death listed as a self-inflicted wound. Tom is careful, professionally smooth, deflecting questions with the practiced ease of a man who is himself complicit, or at minimum deeply invested in the narrative he's selling. Michael Dorman's performance as Tom is understated and crucial. He is not written as a cartoon villain, which would be easy. He is written as a man with his own complex position. He is Adrian's brother, presumably shaped by growing up in proximity to the same controlling environment that Adrian later imposed on Cecilia. And there's a question that floats through his scenes about how much he knew, how much he enabled, and how much he genuinely believes the story he's telling. Dolman keeps all of those questions alive without resolving them, which is exactly right. When Cecilia presses him, was there a body? Are you absolutely certain he's dead? Tom gives her the kind of answer that is technically complete and emotionally evasive. Yes, there was a body. Yes, it was identified. The implication is, drop this, move on, take the money, it's always the money. That 5 million clause hanging over every conversation, contaminating every claim Cecilia makes, ensuring that her most urgent need, to be believed, is always shadowed by the structure that punishes her for making it. The night camera. In a particularly inventive stretch of the second act, Cecilia sets up a camera. She positions it to record the guest room while she sleeps, a self-surveillance designed to catch what she can't see with her own eyes. It's a smart move, the kind of practical, methodical response to a supernatural situation that makes you root for a protagonist. She's not waiting to be believed. She's trying to build proof. She reviews the footage, hours of her own sleeping face. And this is a moment that will make the hair on your arms stand up if you're watching in the right frame of mind, there's a brief, almost imperceptible disturbance in the footage. A compression artifact, or a fold in the air, or something, just for a second, just long enough to make you question whether you saw it. Cecilia stares at the screen, rewinds, watches again, there, and then not there. It's not conclusive. It never is. Whannell is relentless in his commitment to keeping the evidence at exactly the level of deniability that makes it useless as proof while making it overwhelming as personal experience. This is, again, the structure of gaslighting described from the inside. You know what you know, and the knowing is not enough, because the knowing was never the point. The point is that you can't make anyone else know it. The suit. Here's where the film makes its bravest narrative choice in this section of the story, and the one that most divided critics on a pure plotting level. Cecilia finds the suit. Whannell doesn't make the audience wait until the third act for confirmation that the threat is real. About midway through the second act, earlier than you'd expect, Cecilia discovers a hidden compartment in Adrian's studio space, finds the suit, and puts on the hood. The mirror shows no reflection where her head should be. The technology is real. Adrian built it. Some critics felt this deflated the film's tension by confirming what was already obvious. I'd argue the opposite. The confirmation does something more interesting than sustained ambiguity would have done. It shifts the horror from existential, is this real, to specific. What do I do with real? Once Cecilia knows, once we know, confirmed beyond doubt. The film becomes about the trap, not the mystery. And the trap is where the genuinely sophisticated horror lives. Because Cecilia now has proof. The suit is in her hands. And she still can't use it because the suit is in a location she doesn't legally have access to. Found through means that would be inadmissible. And the man who built it is officially dead. She could show it to James. She could show it to Emily. And even then, even with the physical object in her hands, she'd be asking people to accept that her supposedly dead ex-boyfriend is alive, invisible, and orchestrating a campaign of psychological terror against her. In 2020, in suburban San Francisco, try explaining that to a police officer, try explaining it to a judge, try explaining it at all without watching the listener's face. Do that careful, worried thing. That means they've already decided what category of person you are. The recurring camera pan. By this point in the film, Whannell has established a visual rhythm that operates almost subliminally. The slow pan to empty space. It happens again here, several times, in several different rooms, and each time the effect is different because the context is different. Early in the film, those pans felt like suggestion. Maybe something, maybe not. By the middle of the second act, they feel like confirmation of something terrible. The camera moves to an empty corner and you're not wondering if something is there anymore. You're watching for it. Your eyes are scanning the edges of the frame, the way Cecilia's eyes are scanning the edges of every room she enters. You and she are experiencing the same perceptual state, that awful, exhausting, fully activated alertness of someone who knows the threat is present but can't look at it. And Whannell sustains this. He doesn't give you release. He doesn't cut away to Adrian checking his suit or confirm the audience's knowledge through a perspective shot. He keeps you locked in Cecilia's point of view, which means he keeps you in her uncertainty, which means the film's formal strategy is inseparable from its emotional argument. You understand what she's going through, not because the film tells you it's awful, but because it makes you live it in real time. The breaking point. The second act's first major escalation. The thing that converts the film's quiet accumulation of dread into open crisis is the incident at the dinner table. James has organized a family dinner. His daughter Sydney is there. Emily comes. It's an attempt at normalcy, at community, at warmth. Exactly the kind of thing Cecilia needs and exactly the kind of thing Adrian will use as a lever. Cecilia is at the table when she feels it again. That presence, that certainty, and then her wine glass moves on its own, slides deliberately across the table in front of everyone. She reacts. Of course she reacts. And in reacting, in standing up, in pointing at the table, in saying, "Do you see that? Did you see that?" she breaks the social contract of the dinner, disrupts the carefully maintained normalcy, and gives everyone at the table the opportunity to observe her in a state that reads from the outside as a kind of break with reality. James is patient with her, Emily is worried, Sydney is watching. And somewhere in the room, making none of this happen by accident, Adrian Griffin is watching all of it with the satisfaction of a man whose plan is proceeding exactly as designed. The dinner scene is the second act's first full declaration of war, and it ends with Cecilia alone in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, having just survived a small, perfect, utterly unprovable ambush. The horror of this film is not in the special effects, it's in that the morning after the dinner is quiet in the way that only mornings after disasters are quiet. Nobody is saying anything directly. James makes coffee. Sydney leaves for school early. The house hums with the specific, careful silence of people who care about each other and don't know how to talk about what happened last night without it becoming something bigger than any of them are ready to handle. Cecilia sits in it. She's been here before, not in this house, not with these people, but in this particular social weather. The aftermath of something she experienced that nobody else can fully confirm. What's extraordinary about Moss's performance in these quieter stretches is how she communicates the cost of maintenance, the cost of holding yourself together. Cecilia is, in every scene of the second act, performing a version of okayness that is gradually becoming harder to sustain. It's not that she's faking, she's genuinely trying, genuinely fighting to function. But the effort of functioning while being systematically hunted is visible in her body. The set of her jaw, the fractional pause before she speaks, that micro beat of internal editing, the way she moves through rooms with her peripheral vision always working, always cataloging. She looks, to anyone paying close attention, exactly like what she is, a person burning enormous reserves of energy just to appear normal. And that appearance of normalcy is, paradoxically, part of what makes her so vulnerable. Because a woman who is visibly, dramatically falling apart gets a specific kind of concern and intervention. A woman who is holding it together, who seems functional, who only occasionally has what looks like a breakdown at a dinner table, that woman gets worry and distance and the quiet accumulation of other people's doubt. The email. The strike that breaks open the second act's central crisis comes from outside the house, and it's devastating in its precision. Sydney receives an email. It appears to be from Cecilia, and the content of the email is cruel in a very specific way. It isn't raving or hysterical, which would make it easier to dismiss as the product of instability. It's calculated. It tells Sydney, in measured professional language, that her architecture portfolio is weak, that her ambitions are unrealistic, and that she shouldn't count on the letter of recommendation Cecilia had offered to write. It hits every vulnerable point Sydney has: her self-doubt about her talent, her anxiety about the future, her tentative trust in the mentor relationship she'd been building with Cecilia. Sydney, hurt and blindsided, shows the email to her father. James confronts Cecilia. He's not angry, exactly. He's a man trying to be fair, trying to hold multiple possibilities open. But the email is there. It exists. It came from Cecilia's account. And Cecilia, looking at it, knows she didn't send it and cannot prove that she didn't. The same impossible epistemic position, restated in a new key. The writing detail to notice here is the email's tone. Adrian didn't write something unhinged. He wrote something plausible, something that could, if you squint at it from a certain angle, be read as a woman under enormous psychological stress, saying something she half believed and regrets. It's designed to be ambiguous. It's designed to be exactly ambiguous enough that James, who wants to believe Cecilia, is left with a doubt he can't shake. Aldis Hodge handles this confrontation with tremendous restraint. He is not accusatory, he is not cold, but there's a new quality to his regard for Cecilia that wasn't there before, a tiny but perceptible withdrawal of uncomplicated trust, and Hodge makes it felt without underlining it. That withdrawal is James doing his best, being fair, trying not to prejudge. And it still costs Cecilia enormously because she can see it happening and knows she can't stop it. The medical appointment. In an effort to demonstrate her stability, and frankly, because James is clearly concerned enough that she feels the pressure of his concern, Cecilia agrees to see a doctor, a therapist specifically. The session is brief and not played for drama, which is the right choice. The therapist is not a villain. She is not dismissive or condescending. She listens, asks careful questions, and clearly notes that Cecilia is presenting with symptoms consistent with severe trauma, hypervigilance, paranoid ideation, difficulty trusting her own perceptions. None of this is wrong. All of these things are true of Cecilia. The tragedy is that the explanation the therapist reaches for, complex PTSD from an abusive relationship, now manifesting as anxiety and perceptual disturbances, is simultaneously clinically reasonable and catastrophically incomplete. Because Cecilia does have those things. The trauma is real. The hypervigilance is appropriate. The paranoia is not actually paranoia. And the medical framework, applied by a caring professional doing their best with the information available, becomes another instrument of Adrian's design. Get the woman into therapy, have the therapy reach conclusions that make her experiences look like symptoms. Watch the treatment of her real trauma become evidence against her impossible to treat real situation. It's diabolical, and it's diabolical in a way that doesn't require anyone to be evil. It only requires a structure in which one person has the power to make reality unverifiable and everyone else is doing their jobs. What Blumhouse understood, quick detour here, and it's relevant, I promise. One of the reasons this section of the film works as horror rather than just as a domestic drama about abuse is that Blumhouse's production model gave Whannell something that bigger budget productions often destroy: tonal control. When you're making a 200 million blockbuster, there are dozens of stakeholders who have opinions about how frightening it can be, how ambiguous, how unresolved. Test screenings, studio notes, the pressure to ensure that mainstream audiences are comfortable. None of that is inherently malicious. It's commercial filmmaking doing what commercial filmmaking does. But the particular horror of this second act, the horror of watching a woman's reality be systematically invalidated by the very systems designed to protect her, requires that the film never reassure you, never give you the comfort of a sympathetic authority figure who says, "I believe you." Never offer the catharsis of someone in power taking Cecilia's side. Blumhouse's model, which essentially trusts the director to make the film they set out to make, preserve that discomfort intact. And the discomfort is the point, the scholarship letter. The next escalation is quieter than the email incident and in some ways worse. Cecilia finds a letter. It's on James's desk, a letter from an architecture school addressed to Sydney, informing her that a scholarship application has been submitted on her behalf. A substantial scholarship. The letter references a recommendation written by Cecilia, and the recommendation, when Cecilia reads it, is glowing, specific, deeply felt. The kind of letter that a genuine mentor would write for a student she believed in completely. Cecilia did not write this letter. She stares at it for a long time because this is different from the email. The email was designed to hurt, to drive a wedge, to destroy a relationship. This letter is designed to make Cecilia look unstable, by contrast, to create a record of something generous and wonderful that she didn't do, so that when she says, "I didn't write this," she sounds like a woman who doesn't remember doing kind things. Paranoid, confused. Or, and here's the knife twist, maybe Adrian sent this letter as cover, as a demonstration that he can play both villain and protector, as a reminder that the ground Cecilia stands on is entirely of his making, and he can reshape it in any direction at any moment. This is the psychological sophistication that elevates the film above standard thriller mechanics. Adrian isn't just threatening Cecilia, he's sculpting her reality, building and destroying at will, keeping her perpetually off balance, ensuring that she can never establish stable ground from which to push back. It's control as architecture, and it's all the more terrifying for how invisible it is. Emily, let's talk about Emily properly, because what happens to her is the second act's true breaking point, the moment that converts the film from a study in psychological horror to something that hits with the force of genuine tragedy. Emily Cass has been Cecilia's lifeline from the beginning. She's the one who came to pick her up in the dark from outside Adrian's house. She's the one who has kept checking in, kept showing up, kept insisting on maintaining the connection that Adrian spent years trying to sever. Emily loves her sister with the particular ferocity of someone who watched a person she loves disappear into an abusive relationship and never stop trying to reach her. Cecilia and Emily meet for lunch. It goes wrong fast. In the restaurant, crowded, public, people at every table. Something happens to Cecilia. She loses time. There's a gap, a horrible blank gap in her continuity, and then she's being restrained, and Emily is on the floor, and there's blood, and people are staring, and Cecilia is trying to understand what her own hands just did. Adrian, wearing the suit, attacked Emily while standing behind Cecilia, made it look to everyone in the restaurant like Cecilia attacked her sister across a crowded room with witnesses, on surveillance cameras, with physical evidence, unambiguously, irrefutably, absolutely, from every external perspective. Cecilia attacked her sister. The scene is filmed from Cecilia's point of view, which means we don't see it from outside. We experience her disorientation, the gap in continuity, the horror of arriving at an aftermath she can't account for. And then we watch her try to explain it, watch her say to the police, to the paramedics, to the appalled faces of bystanders that she didn't do it, that something invisible did it, and we see in their expressions exactly how that sounds. This is the film at its most emotionally brutal. Not because of the violence, though the violence is startling, but because of the complete, final, catastrophic destruction of Cecilia's credibility at precisely the moment she most needs to be believed. Emily is hospitalized. The relationship that anchored Cecilia's sense of reality, the one person who had always come to get her, gone. Not dead, but gone. Unreachable, because what do you say to someone you just apparently attacked, whose broken body you're standing over with no explanation you can give them? And Moss, in the aftermath of this scene, is gutting. She plays it with the quality of shattered stillness, not hysterics, not anger, just a kind of terrible clarity. She knows exactly what just happened. She knows who did it. And she knows with absolute certainty that she is now completely, comprehensively alone. The psychiatric ward Cecilia is committed, not by malice on anyone's part, but by the logical operation of a system encountering a person who has just attacked her sister in a public restaurant and is insisting with complete calm that an invisible man did it. The ward scenes are deliberately underplayed. Whannell doesn't sensationalize the environment or play it for one flew over the cuckoo's nest drama. It's just institutional, quiet, the particular flatness of a place where the goal is stabilization, not understanding. Cecilia is there. She's safe, technically. She's fed, medicated, supervised. And she is exactly where Adrian needs her to be, removed from everyone who might help her, documented as mentally ill, her every claim about him now filtered through the formal record of a psychiatric commitment. The 5 million clause in Adrian's will, the one that specified she must not be found mentally ill, is now in play in its full, devastating implication. She's not just broke, she's trapped. The money is gone, and with it, the resources that might have bought her safety, legal help, private investigation. She has nothing. She is, in the most complete and formal sense, exactly where she started. But here's the thing, the ward is where Cecilia thinks. Clearly, without distraction, without the constant low-level alarm of being in a space Adrian might be occupying. And it's in this space of enforced stillness that she begins to put the final pieces together. The suit, revisited. She knew about the suit from her earlier investigation. She knows Adrian built it. She knows he's using it. And now, in the quiet of the ward, she thinks through the operational reality of what that means. The suit requires power. It has limits, probably a battery, probably a weight constraint, probably thermal or atmospheric tells that she hasn't known to look for yet. She thinks about Adrian's death, the official story, the closed casket funeral she wasn't invited to attend, and she starts thinking about Tom. Tom, who handles all the legal work. Tom, who would have arranged the death scene. Tom, who has been smoothly, professionally managing the narrative from the beginning. Tom, who knows exactly what his brother is capable of and has chosen, for whatever reason, to enable it. Tom is not just a lawyer. Tom is infrastructure, and infrastructure has vulnerabilities. Cecilia, locked in a psychiatric ward with no money, no allies, and no credibility, is still thinking, still working, still. And this is the word the film keeps earning for her through every scene, fighting. That's the most important thing to understand about Cecilia Kass as a character. She is not defined by her victimhood. She is defined by the fact that she refuses to stop. The system has swallowed her whole, and she is still in the belly of it, planning her next move. The visit James comes to see her in the ward. He's conflicted. You can read it in the way Hodge carries himself through the visit, the weight of a man who loves someone and doesn't know what to believe about them. He tells her that Emily is recovering. He tells her about the scholarship letter. Sydney got into architecture school, full scholarship. And he tells her, gently but clearly, that he is not sure what to think anymore. Cecilia listens. And then she says something that cuts through all of it, delivered by Moss with the flat, clear energy of someone who has decided to stop managing how they sound. She tells James exactly what she believes happened from the beginning. The suit, the incidents, the email, the restaurant, all of it. No hedging, no softening, no carefully calibrated omissions to avoid sounding crazy. Just the full truth, as she understands it, stated plainly. James's face in this scene is heartbreaking because he clearly wants to believe her, and he clearly can't bring himself to completely. And he clearly feels terrible about that. And none of those feelings change the situation at all. He leaves. She watches him go through the ward's safety glass, and then she looks up. And something about the way she looks up, the direction, the quality of attention, suggests that she's realized she's not alone in the visiting room. She's right. The Wire. What happens next in the visiting room is one of the film's most viscerally frightening sequences, and it's frightening not because of special effects, but because of what it demonstrates about Adrian's psychology. He could have stayed invisible, he could have remained perfectly concealed and let the system continue doing his work for him. Instead, he leans down to her and she feels his breath and he whispers to her. He tells her he loves her. He tells her this is what she made necessary. He tells her that when she comes back to him, when, not if, things will be different. He's still, even now, offering the relationship as the solution. That's the thing that makes him a monster rather than just a villain. He doesn't see what he's doing as punishment. He sees it as courtship. In his framework, he is pursuing her, demonstrating his devotion through the thoroughness of his control, and the logical endpoint of this pursuit is that she returns to him and acknowledges that he was right, that he knows best, that the life he offers, controlled, surveilled, imprisoned, is the life she should want. This is the scene that makes the film's allegory explicit without being heavy-handed. Because this is what domestic abuse looks like at its most extreme, the total conviction of the abuser that love justifies everything, that devotion licenses control, that the person you love not wanting you is a problem to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. Cecilia's response to the whisper is not fear. It's rage, a cold, controlled rage that Moss delivers with the stillness of absolute resolve. She's done being afraid of him. She's done allowing him to determine her reality. Something has settled into place, a decision, a direction, the beginning of the end of the film's long nightmare, and you can feel it click into position in her body. The trap is still closed around her, but Cecilia Kass, for the first time since the film began, knows exactly what she's going to do. There's a specific kind of clarity that arrives when you've lost everything, not serenity. Nothing about Cecilia's situation is serene, but a sharpening, a removal of noise. When you have no credibility, no money, no freedom, and no allies, the decision tree collapses to almost nothing. You can't manage perceptions anymore because they are already managed against you. You can't protect relationships because they are already damaged. All that's left is the problem itself, stripped of all its social scaffolding, and the question of whether you're willing to do whatever the problem actually requires. Cecilia Cass, sitting in a psychiatric ward with Adrian Griffin's breath still in her memory, is willing. What follows in the film's third narrative movement is a sequence of escalations so rapid and so structurally ruthless that the film almost changes genre, pivoting from psychological horror into something closer to a thriller, then back again before arriving at a final act that synthesizes both registers into something genuinely unlike anything else released in its year. This section of the story is where Whannell proves that the slow, deliberate architecture of the first two acts wasn't patience for patience sake, it was loading. Everything that's been building since that clifftop house, since the shower bottle, since the dinner table, it's all about to discharge. The pregnancy before the escape, one more revelation. And it's a quietly devastating one. A doctor at the facility informs Cecilia that she is pregnant. The response Moss gives to this news is one of the finest pieces of acting in the film, which, given that this is a film built entirely on the quality of her acting, is saying something. It isn't horror, it isn't grief, It's a very specific kind of recognition, the look of a person who has just received information that confirms something they already feared, that fills in a gap in a picture they've been assembling, that makes a terrible kind of sense. The pregnancy tells Cecilia something concrete about the period before her escape, about the level of control Adrian exercised, about the fact that his orchestration of her life wasn't just psychological, it was physical, biological, intimate in the most invasive possible sense. She was in a relationship where her own body was not her own, and the pregnancy is the tangible evidence of that violation extending beyond the walls of the clifftop house into her present. The film handles this with the same restraint it applies to every emotionally enormous moment. No melodrama, no extended breakdown. Cecilia processes it in real time, on screen, in the quiet of a wardroom, and then she incorporates it into her understanding of the situation and keeps moving. This is not minimization. It's a portrait of a woman who has learned, through long exposure to controlled environments, to metabolize devastating information quickly and convert it into forward motion. Grief is a luxury she cannot afford right now. The pregnancy also complicates the film's moral landscape in interesting ways. It's not addressed at length. Whannell makes a deliberate choice not to let it overwhelm the film's other concerns. But its presence adds a dimension to the final act's confrontations. Everything Cecilia is fighting for has an additional weight now. She isn't just fighting to reclaim her own life. She is fighting to decide what kind of life is possible, what future she is allowed to build, whether a child conceived under the conditions Adrian designed is something she can choose freely, or whether it's one more thing he's taken from her. Getting out. The mechanics of Cecilia's escape from the psychiatric facility are engineered with the same economy Whannell brings to everything. She doesn't blow through walls or overpower guards. She is precise, methodical, and patient. A woman who has spent years learning to read environments for vulnerabilities because survival in Adrian's house required exactly that skill set. There's a beautiful inversion here that's worth naming, the hypervigilance and environmental awareness that Adrian's abuse baked into Cecilia's nervous system. The same qualities that make her seem unstable to the people around her are also her greatest tactical assets. She notices things other people don't. She reads spaces, reads timing, reads the behavior patterns of the people moving around her. The damage and the capability are the same thing, which is one of the more sophisticated observations the film makes about trauma. It doesn't just break you, it also, in terrible and involuntary ways, prepares you. She gets out. The how matters less than the fact of it, and more than the fact of it, the where she is going. Because she has received information that pulls her out of the ward with an urgency that overrides every other consideration. Emily called, or someone claiming to be Emily from Adrian's house. And Cecilia, who knows her sister, who knows Adrian, who has spent months learning to read the architecture of his manipulations, immediately understands that this is a lure, a trap, but a trap baited with the one thing she cannot ignore, the possibility that Emily is in danger. The house, again Adrian's clifftop house, seen for the second time, lands differently than it did at the film's opening. In the escape sequence, the house was night and terror and the desperate geometry of getting out. Now it's daylight and it's quiet, and Cecilia is the one choosing to enter it. The power dynamic has inverted, at least spatially, and the film acknowledges this through the cinematography, which holds on the building's glass facade with a quality of exposure rather than oppression. Light everywhere, nowhere to hide, except of course that hiding is exactly what's happening. Inside the house, Cecilia moves carefully, reading the space. She's been here before in her mind many times. She knows where Adrian works. She knows where he keeps things. She's reconstructed the house's layout through memory and research and the particular knowledge that comes from having lived with someone, knowing their rhythms, their habits, the places they return to when they need to feel in control. Tom is there. Michael Dorman's Tom, encountered in this context, in his brother's house, surrounded by his brother's things, with Cecilia standing in front of him, looking like someone who has nothing left to lose, is rattled in a way his earlier boardroom smoothness concealed entirely. He's out of his element here. The professional insulation he maintains in legal offices and controlled meetings doesn't hold in the actual physical space of what Adrian has built and what Tom has enabled. He looks, for the first time, like what he is. A man who has been complicit in something monstrous and is now within arm's reach of its consequences. The conversation between them is clipped, electric, full of the specific tension of two people circling a truth that neither of them is willing to state directly. Tom maintains the fiction. Of course, he's been maintaining it this long, but there's something lacking in it, some barely perceptible give, and Cecilia, who has been reading people in survival mode for months, can feel it. And then Adrian acts. Tom's death. What happens in this scene is a measure of how thoroughly Whannell has committed to his premise. Adrian, invisible, is in the room. He has been in the room, possibly, since before Cecilia arrived. He has engineered this confrontation, lured Cecilia here, ensured Tom would be present, with the specific intention of ending Tom's usefulness and destroying Cecilia's last remaining claim to freedom simultaneously. Tom is killed. The violence is sudden, brutal, and staged with horrible clarity. Cecilia is present, Cecilia is proximate, and the physical evidence of the scene, when police arrive, will tell a story in which Cecilia is the agent of what happened. A knife, blood, a woman with no credibility, no alibi, a recent psychiatric commitment on her record, standing in the house of the man she'd fled from over the body of his brother. The staging of this moment, the split-second choreography of it, the way Adrian uses Cecilia's physical presence to construct the tableau he needs, is the film's most direct statement about how abusers weaponize systems. He isn't strong enough to simply recapture her. He can't publicly coerce her. What he can do is use her against herself, use her presence, her proximity, the interpretive frameworks that have already been constructed around her to continue the story he's been telling about her. Unstable, dangerous, unbelievable. And God, it works. The police arrive. They see what they see. They take Cecilia into custody, again with all the careful correctness of an institution encountering a situation that fits the pattern it's been primed to expect. The revelation in the house, but something has shifted. Something the film has been quietly building toward for two full acts is about to surface. Police conducting a thorough search of Adrian's property, investigating the death, looking for evidence, discover something in the building's lower level, a space, secured, almost hidden, that contains a man, Adrian Griffin, alive, chained, apparently captive. The discovery detonates through the film's narrative with the force of a genuine structural surprise. Here is Adrian, in the flesh, looking haggard and frightened and like a man who has been held against his will. And the story that forms around this discovery, rapidly, inevitably, with the terrible efficiency of a narrative that fits neatly into existing frameworks, is that Tom was the one in the suit. That Tom, perhaps jealous, perhaps controlling, perhaps harboring his own obsessions, built or stole the technology and used it. That Adrian is not the monster. That Adrian is a victim. Cecilia watches this story be assembled around her. She watches the people in that house absorb it, find it credible, begin to organize their understanding of recent events around it. She watches Adrian, pale and relieved, looking, receive the concern and the care that the story of his captivity commands. And she knows, with the same absolute, unverifiable, body-deep certainty she has known everything in this film, that it isn't true. He built this. This is the final layer of the architecture. Tom's death cleared the one person who could contradict the story. The captivity scene provides Adrian with victimhood, and Cecilia, already documented, already committed, already framed for Tom's death, has exactly as much credibility in this moment as she's had throughout. None. Moss's face in this sequence is the film's emotional apex, before the final confrontation resets the register entirely. She's watching the full scope of what Adrian has done come into focus. Not just the stalking, not just the gaslighting, not just the crime she can name, but the totality of his design, the years of planning, the layers of contingency, the fact that even getting out, even surviving, even fighting back with everything she had, she arrived at this, standing in custody while he receives sympathy, watched by the police as a murder suspect while he is treated as a victim. She isn't broken by this. She's enraged. And the specific quality of her rage, cold, precise, strategic, the opposite of the emotional volatility she's been dismissed for throughout the film, is the thing that's going to carry her through what comes next. What the film has built. Let's step back from the plot for a moment, because the architecture Whannell has constructed across these first four acts deserves acknowledgement before we move into the final sequence. The story of the Invisible Man is structured at its deepest level as a demonstration, not a demonstration of what invisibility technology can do, though that's the surface mechanism. a demonstration of how power operates when it's held by one person over another in a system of institutions and social structures that, through no specific malice, consistently favor the powerful. Adrian hasn't done anything illegal that can be proven. He hasn't been caught. He hasn't left fingerprints. Every institution Cecilia has encountered, the police, the medical system, the legal framework governing the will, has operated correctly within its own logic and produced outcomes that serve Adrian's purposes. This is not a film about corrupt institutions. It's a film about how institutions operating normally can be weaponized by someone who understands them well enough and has the resources to manipulate context. James is a good man. The doctors are competent professionals. The police are doing their jobs. The law firm handled a legal arrangement correctly. Nobody failed Cecilia through malice or negligence. They failed her because the situation Adrian engineered was designed to produce exactly those failures, and the systems around her didn't have the tools to see it. James. Again, there's a scene shortly after the discovery of Adrian in the basement where James comes to see Cecilia in custody, and this time, something has changed in him. He's been thinking, he's been doing the work of revisiting his own certainty, his own readiness to absorb the story Adrian's situation seemed to tell. And Hodge plays this shift with the same restraint he's brought to every scene. Not a dramatic pivot, not an apology, but a man in the process of recalibrating, quietly and with considerable personal cost, his understanding of what's been happening. He tells her, he believes her. 3 words, and the weight they carry. Coming this late, coming after everything, is almost unbearable to watch. Not because they fix anything, they don't. The charges are still there. Adrian is still free. The situation is still what it is. She just absorbs it, nods, and starts talking, laying out what she knows, what she's pieced together, what she needs, because the belief is only useful if it translates into action. And Cecilia Kass, even now, is thinking in terms of what comes next. What comes next is the plan. The trap takes shape. The plan that Cecilia begins to sketch, with James quietly, carefully, is built on a simple but devastating insight. Adrian wants her back. That's what this entire campaign has been about. Not punishment, not destruction. Retrieval. Cecilia isn't primarily trying to send Adrian to prison. She's trying to establish conclusively, physically, in her own hands, the truth of what she's been living for the past months. She needs the reality she's been gaslit about to become undeniable. Not for a jury, not for the public record, but for herself. The film understands this. And in understanding it, it arrives at a finale that is deeply, genuinely, uncomfortably satisfying, not despite the darkness of what it asks Cecilia to do, but because of it. The final act of the Invisible Man operates on a different frequency than everything that came before it. The first act was dread. The second act was suffocation. The third act is, and this is a word that requires careful handling given everything the film has put you through, empowerment. Not the uncomplicated kind. Not the action movie version where the protagonist gets a montage and a weapon and takes her power back in a clean, cathartic sequence. She is going to do what he spent months engineering toward: reach out, acknowledge him, initiate contact. She is going to make him believe the campaign worked, that she is broken enough, isolated enough, out of options enough, that she is willing to come back. This requires Cecilia to perform something she has every right to never perform again: vulnerability to Adrian Griffin. Public, controlled, her choice. And the specific selection of a restaurant is not accidental, it's tactical. A public space with witnesses and surveillance cameras levels the playing field in ways that Adrian's invisible suit can't entirely neutralize. He can still be invisible in a restaurant, but Cecilia can also be very, very visible. She can be the woman sitting across from a table, having a dinner, behaving completely normally, or not. She can be the person who creates a scene that forces the suit's wearer into action in front of surveillance cameras. She can, in short, set conditions in which Adrian's response to being provoked is the evidence she needs. James will be there, not at the table, in the restaurant, with a team, watching, ready. The plan is thin. It depends on variables Cecilia can't fully control. It depends on Adrian being exactly as predictable as she believes him to be, which is itself a kind of bet. She is trusting that she knows him well enough to run a play on him in the same moment that she's been told, systematically, that her knowledge of him is paranoia. The plan is an act of faith in her own perception. The thing the film has spent 2 hours telling her she can't trust. not with anxiety, with patience. The patience of a man who was always certain she'd call. Oliver Jackson. Cohen does something precise with this phone call. His voice in this moment is warm, genuinely, disturbingly warm. Because from Adrian's perspective, this is the moment he's been working toward, the vindication of everything. She called him, she reached out. In his framework, the months of terror and isolation were not cruelty, they were courtship, and this call is acceptance. His warmth is real, that's what makes it monstrous. Cecilia's side of the call requires her to perform capitulation, to sound tired, to sound out of options, to let him hear what he wants to hear in her voice. They agree on a time, a place. His choice of restaurant to give him the sense of control he needs. Cecilia smiles thinly after she hangs up, not with pleasure, with the particular grim satisfaction of a gamble committed to. He gives Cecilia space to speak, to say what she's come to say, while his body language communicates absolute certainty about the outcome. He already knows she's come back. He just wants her to say it. The surface of the dinner is almost seductive in how normal it looks. Two people, candles, a nice restaurant. The conversation has the texture of a reconciliation, careful, feeling its way, full of the kind of pauses that occur when people are being honest. And Cecilia is being honest, in a way. She's telling him that she knows what he's done. She's laying it out, quietly, in measured terms, watching his face as she does it. His face doesn't change. That's the tell. He says he wants to help her. He says this with such practiced sincerity that if you didn't know, if you hadn't lived the film alongside Cecilia, you might almost believe him. And then Cecilia excuses herself to use the restroom. The turn in the restroom, Cecilia does something the film has been building towards since the psychiatric ward. She takes the wire she's been wearing, the wire James insisted on as part of the plan, and she removes it deliberately. She takes it off and she leaves it on the sink. This is the moment where the film's moral complexity crystallizes into a single decision. With the wire, she has witnesses. With the wire, she has the legal scaffolding of a plan built on institutional legitimacy. James and his team listening, recording, ready to act on what they hear. Without the wire, she has only herself, her knowledge of this man, her judgment about what the situation requires, and her willingness to do whatever that judgment tells her to do. There are viewers who find it deeply satisfying. The final, complete rejection of institutional frameworks that have failed her, the choice to handle her own situation on her own terms. There are viewers who find it troubling, who see in it a rejection of the rule of law that the film doesn't adequately interrogate. Both responses are valid. Adrian's composure cracks, not dramatically, not through confession or outrage, but in the specific way that the composure of a controlling person cracks when the controlled person does something outside the script. Cecilia, back from the restroom, has changed in some quality that he can read. The performance he came to the dinner expecting, the return, the capitulation, the acknowledgement is not what she's giving him. She's different. And different is the one thing his entire system cannot accommodate. She asks him directly, will he ever stop? Will he ever let her be free? His answer, delivered with the smooth regret of a man who genuinely believes what he's saying, is essentially no, he'll never stop. Because to him, this isn't harassment, it's love. And love in his framework doesn't stop, can't stop, wouldn't be love if it stopped. The physical confrontation that follows is brutal and quick. James is concerned about Cecilia. Cecilia is present, fully, strangely present, not dissociating, not breaking down, but inhabiting the moment with the quality of clear-eyed attention that has been the film's portrait of her strength throughout. She's still here, she's still herself. Whatever this night has cost her, and the film acknowledges, through Moss's face, that it has cost something. She is still the person she was before Adrian Griffin decided to make her his. The legal situation is complicated. The film doesn't pretend otherwise. There are things Cecilia will have to answer for, questions she'll have to navigate, a world that will have its own opinions about what happened tonight. The institutional machinery doesn't disappear because she survived it. But the specific immediate threat of Adrian, the invisible man in the room, the breath on her neck, the moved shower bottle, the turned painting, the orchestrated disasters, is over. And for the first time since the film began, Cecilia Kass is in a space where the danger she feels is proportionate to the danger that exists. The final scene. The film ends with a scene of very deliberate, very carefully staged ambiguity, and it's worth spending real time on it because it's doing more work than it might appear to. Cecilia is back in Adrian's house, the cliff-top fortress, the glass walls, She moves through it differently than she did in the opening, not in terror, not in desperate escape, but with the measured, purposeful movement of someone reclaiming space. She's dressed in all black, her face is still. She finds Adrian's studio, his equipment, the specific spaces where he built the things he used to hunt her. And the film, typically, consistently, correctly, refuses to tell you how to feel about this image. She's free. The thing that imprisoned her is behind her. She's moving forward, but she's also carrying everything that got her here. The pregnancy, the deaths, the choice she made at the restaurant table, the wire she removed in the bathroom. All of it is in her body as she walks. And Moss doesn't let the film pretend otherwise. She moves with the weight of the whole story, and the freedom is real, and the weight is real, and the image is big enough to hold both. The camera doesn't rush to cut away. No clean institutional justice. No confirmation that the world has learned anything from what it put her through. Just Cecilia, moving forward in a world that is exactly as difficult as it was before she started, and her undeniably still in it. Why the ending works. Some films earn ambiguous endings and some don't. The Invisible Man earns it completely because the ambiguity isn't evasiveness. It isn't a filmmaker ducking the implications of the story. It's a filmmaker who has been making a specific argument for 2 hours and commits to that argument all the way to the final frame. The argument is this: systems built to protect people often don't. Cecilia Kass begins this film with nothing, not even freedom. She ends it with herself, intact, moving. In the film's moral economy, that's everything. Every great horror film has a formal language, a set of visual and sonic rules that it establishes early and then exploits throughout, training the audience to respond to specific stimuli in specific ways until the filmmakers can trigger those responses at will. The Invisible Man has one of the most disciplined formal languages in recent horror cinema, and understanding how it works is, in some ways, more interesting than the story itself. Because the story is about what you can't prove. The craft is about what you can't help but feel. Let's start with the camera. Stefan Duchot and the glamour of suspicion, Leigh Whannell, brought in Australian cinematographer Stefan Duchot for this film, and the collaboration produced something genuinely distinctive. Duchot's work on the film operates from a single, elegant premise: the camera knows more than the characters, but less than it should. It occupies a position of partial knowledge. It can see everything in the frame, but the frame is always potentially incomplete. Something might be just outside it, something might be in it already, unrevealed. This premise generates the film's signature move, the slow pan to empty space. It happens by rough count more than a dozen times across the film's runtime. The camera drifts away from Cecilia, mid-scene, mid-conversation, sometimes mid-sentence, to settle on a doorway, a corner, an apparently vacant stretch of hallway. It holds, nothing happens, or nothing visible happens. The first time Whannell deploys this, it reads as atmosphere. The second time, it feels deliberate. This is behavioral modification through cinema. Whannell and Duchot are rewiring your pattern recognition in real time, converting an ordinary compositional choice, the held shot, into a vessel of pure dread. And they do it without a single special effect. Just framing, just duration, just the patience to hold the empty frame long enough for your imagination to do the work. The lens choice and focal length. The film was shot predominantly with longer focal lengths, lenses in the 50mm, 85mm, 85mm range for close work, with strategic use of wider angles in the architecture-heavy exterior shots of Adrian's house. This isn't accidental. Longer focal lengths compress space, flattening depth and reducing the visible distance between foreground subjects and background elements. The practical effect is that backgrounds feel closer than they are, that the space behind Cecilia in any given shot feels more present, more proximate, more occupied, combined with the film's use of shallow depth of field, keeping Cecilia in sharp focus while the space behind her softens into blur. This creates a specific perceptual effect. You know there's space back there, you know things could be in it, but the image gives you just enough information to be uncertain and not enough to be sure. The hallway behind her is full of soft shapes that could be furniture, shadows, walls, or something else. And the longer the shot holds, the harder it becomes to simply accept the blur as furniture. Amber tones, domestic light, the slightly imperfect quality of space that's been lived in rather than curated. The color temperature communicates safety, or at least the attempt at safety, the intention of it, which makes the intrusion of Adrian's influence into this space all the more viscerally wrong. When the painting turns to face the wall, when the keys move, when the wine glass slides across the table, these events happen in warm toned domestic space, and the violation feels personal in a way it wouldn't if they happened in Adrian's cold glass house. The warmth makes the intrusion worse. The film's third act, the restaurant confrontation and its aftermath, uses a different palette altogether, cooler than James's house, warmer than Adrian's, a kind of neutral ground that belongs to neither character's established visual world. It's the color of confrontation, the color of something being settled. Camera movement, controlled drift. The film's camera movement is, for the most part, extraordinarily restrained, and the restraint is doing work. Most contemporary action inflected films use kinetic camera movement as a default state, building energy through constant motion. Whannell and Duccio's camera mostly doesn't move at all, or moves with a slow, almost meditative drift that refuses the urgency of a handheld approach. The effect is that when the camera does move quickly, in the escape sequence, in the restaurant confrontation, in the physical struggle in Adrian's house, the movement reads as genuinely alarming. The visual system has been calibrated to expect stillness, and the violation of that stillness hits with proportional force. This is basic perceptual psychology applied to filmmaking with real discipline. You can only be startled by something that deviates from expectation, so you spend the film establishing the expectation very carefully. There's one moment in the attic sequence when Cecilia moves through the space with a flashlight where the camera does something unusual. It doesn't follow her. It stays at the entrance to the attic, watching from a fixed position, and she moves away from it into the dark space of the frame. This creates a specific kind of dread because it puts the camera, and by extension, the audience, in the position of watching from behind, not beside her, behind her. In the position that, in this film's grammar, is the position of the invisible threat. You're suddenly aligned with the wrong perspective, and that misalignment, that brief, uncomfortable occupying of Adrian's vantage point, is one of the film's cleverest formal moves. It makes you complicit in the watching, and is disturbing in a way that lingers. Negative space as character. One of the concepts that defines the film's visual approach is the deliberate use of negative space, the parts of the frame that contain nothing, as an active dramatic element rather than a passive compositional choice. In most films, empty space in the frame is exactly that, empty. Background, filler. In The Invisible Man, empty space is where the protagonist lives, not Adrian, the invisible character, but Cecilia, who is psychologically living in the space between what she can see and what she knows. Her entire experience of reality, from the film's second act onward, is defined by that gap, the space between the visible and the actual. Duccio's compositions consistently give this empty space visual weight. Through lighting, through the quality of attention the camera gives to apparently unoccupied corners, through the length of time shots hold on backgrounds after Cecilia has moved out of frame. The space gets screen time, it earns the audience's attention, and eventually it earns their dread, because the film has trained them to understand that space is where Adrian is. There's an entire filmmaking philosophy embedded in this approach. Horror doesn't require a monster to be visible. It requires the audience to believe the monster might be anywhere. Once you achieve that, negative space does all the work for you. Sound design, Benjamin Wallfisch, and the frequency of fear. If the cinematography is the film's visible grammar, the sound design is its invisible one. And in a film about invisibility, that's more than a metaphor. Composer Benjamin Wallfisch's score for The Invisible Man is one of the most sophisticated pieces of horror scoring in recent memory, and it's sophisticated precisely because of how little of it sounds like a traditional horror score. There are no sudden, crashing orchestral stings, no thunderous brass hits to underline jump scares, no melodic leitmotif for the invisible man that signals his presence before he acts. What Wallfisch built instead is essentially a sound architecture, a system of frequencies, textures, and tonal environments that manipulate the listening experience at a level below conscious awareness. Much of the score operates in low, sub-bass frequencies that don't register as music exactly, they register as physical sensation. A heaviness in the chest, a barely perceptible vibration in the seat, a sense of pressure that the conscious mind doesn't identify as coming from speakers but the body registers as ambient threat. This is infrasound territory, the frequency range that researchers have associated with feelings of unease, paranoia, and the conviction of unseen presences. Whether Wolfish was deliberately exploiting this physiological phenomenon or arrived at it through compositional instinct, the effect is the same. The score makes you feel watched before anything visible has happened to justify the feeling. The score's absence, equally important to what Wolfish wrote, is what he and Whannell chose not to score. Large sections of the film run in complete or near complete silence. The escape sequence that opens the film has almost no music until the car starts. The attic scene is silent. The coffee shop incident, the moving wine glass, many of the film's most frightening moments happen in sonic environments that are emphatically ordinary: ambient restaurant noise, the hum of domestic space, the specific acoustic quality of a room with no one in it. This silence is strategic. The audience's sonic experience mirrors her psychological one. When the score does come in, particularly in the second half of the film, as events escalate, it arrives with the force of long withheld pressure releasing. The contrast between the silence and the sound makes the sound viscerally more effective than it would be in a film that deployed music continuously. Diegetic sound, the world listening. The film's use of diegetic sound that exists within the film's world rather than on the soundtrack, is as carefully considered as any visual element. The sound of breathing, footsteps on hardwood, the specific creak of a house settling versus the specific creak of a house bearing weight it shouldn't be bearing. These are the sonic details Cecilia is tuned to throughout the film, and Whannell's sound designers, supervising sound editor Jane Tattersall and her team built a soundscape in which these ordinary sounds carry extraordinary charge. There's a sequence in the middle of the film where Cecilia is lying in bed and the sound mix goes to near silence and then almost inaudible, designed to make you doubt whether you heard it. There's a breath, not hers, just a breath, in the room. The decision not to make this sound obvious, not to amplify it, not to give it a reverb that announces its significance, is a choice of considerable courage, because a portion of the audience will have missed it, and a portion will have caught it and immediately questioned whether they caught it. Just a slight textural addition to the soundscape that, once you've heard the suit operating in the film's more visible sequences, your ear can retrospectively identify in the earlier ambiguous scenes. This is an elegant piece of retroactive sound architecture. On first viewing, you don't consciously register the tone. On second viewing, or in retrospect, thinking about scenes you've already watched, the presence of the tone becomes evidence, proof, worked into the sonic texture of exactly when Adrian was in the room. The film hides the answer in the soundscape and trusts its audience to find it. Not because silence is neutral, but because in this film's world, silence is what unseen danger sounds like. And by the time you're deep into the second act, you've learned to hear it the same way Cecilia does. Not as absence, as presence. A film about an invisible threat lives or dies on its visible one. Everything Leigh Whannell built with the camera, the technical apparatus of the film, exists to serve her performance. And her performance, in turn, justifies every technical choice. It's a reciprocal relationship, perfectly calibrated. But performance doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in time, in the relationship between shots, in the decisions an editor makes about duration and rhythm, and when to cut and when to hold. So this section of the analysis is really about two things that are inseparable: what Moss gives and how editor Christian Ghazal shapes what she gives into the experience you actually have watching the film. The architecture of Elisabeth Moss's performance. Moss has talked in interviews about her preparation for this role, the research into abuse survivor psychology, the conversations with Whannell about Cecilia's interior life, the physical preparation for the action sequences in the third act. The film deliberately withholds those conventional performance outlets, and Moss fills the resulting space with something quieter and more devastating: the continuous, visible cost of survival. Watch her hands throughout the film. It's a detail that rewards attention. Moss uses her hands differently in different emotional states. When Cecilia is in hypervigilant mode, her hands are controlled, still, held close to her body. When she is briefly comfortable, briefly safe, they relax fractionally. When she's performing okayness for an audience she doesn't trust, the hands do a specific control thing, positioned deliberately, not naturally, that communicates the effort of the performance within the performance. It's the kind of physical specificity that you don't consciously notice on first viewing, but that accumulates in your body as authentic. That makes Cecilia feel like a real person rather than a narrative function. The eyes are the other thing. Moss has eyes that communicate interior states with extraordinary precision, not through theatrical expression, not through wide pupils or dramatic tears, but through focus. The quality of her attention shifts scene by scene, and each shift tells you exactly where Cecilia is psychologically. In James's house, in the early scenes, her gaze is diffuse, scanning, tracking, never settling. The flashbacks. The inability to function in basic social situations. The eventual breakthrough scene where the survivor tells their story and is believed and begins to heal. These tropes aren't dishonest, they're drawn from real experiences, but they've been deployed so frequently that they've become a kind of shorthand, a performance grammar that audiences recognize as this character has been through something. Moss and Whannell, in explicit conversations ahead of filming, agreed to reject most of this grammar. Every scene in which Cecilia is performing normalcy, having a conversation, eating a meal, being present in a social situation, has a quality of energy expenditure. Not because Moss plays it with visible strain, but because she plays it with visible effort of a very subtle kind. Cecilia is working all the time. This is trauma as Moss and the researchers she consulted describe it, not the dramatic, visible kind, but the constant, exhausting, invisible labor of being a person who has been broken and is forcing themselves to remain whole anyway. It's a portrait of extraordinary resilience, and it's also a portrait of how resilience can be weaponized against the person exercising it. How a woman's ability to function can make her suffering invisible in the same way a certain kind of abuser tries to make his violence invisible. The physical transformation across the film's runtime, Moss's physical presence changes. Her posture carries the tension more openly. The control she exerts over her physical presentation is still there, but it's visibly effortful in a way it wasn't at the beginning. And then in the third act, particularly in the restaurant scene and everything that follows, something in the physical performance expands. Cecilia takes up more space. Not aggressively, not dramatically, but functionally. She moves with the authority of someone who has decided to be fully present in her own body, in her own choices, on her own terms. The compactness is gone. In its place is something that reads unmistakably as the physical expression of agency reclaimed. She is, without question, the film's emotional center and its most demanding performance challenge. But Jackson-Cohen's work as Adrian deserves genuine attention, partly because it's accomplished under significant constraints. Adrian is largely invisible. Jackson-Cohen spent much of the shoot in the suit, a practical, physical performance of movement and stillness with no face to work with, limited to body language and breath. The work he did in the suit, which informed the physicality of scenes he wasn't even in directly, is something that's easy to overlook but crucial to how those scenes land. The weight of Adrian's presence in the invisible sequences is real weight. Someone in a suit, breathing, moving, occupying space. It's physical acting of a demanding and unglamorous kind, and it gives the film's middle section a material reality it wouldn't have with purely digital effects. But the scenes where we do see Adrian's face, the opening escape, the restaurant confrontation, the discovery in the basement, are where Jackson-Cohen demonstrates what makes the performance work. He plays Adrian without a single moment of obvious villainy. There's no leering, no menacing glint, no theatrical cruelty. What he gives you instead is a very specific kind of warmth that's just slightly wrong, like a frequency that's almost in tune but not quite. It's the warmth of a man who has convinced himself that everything he does is love. And that self-conviction, played without irony or self-awareness, is what makes Adrian genuinely frightening rather than just threatening. The restaurant scene requires Jackson-Cohen to modulate between several registers almost simultaneously. The performed warmth of a man at a reconciliation dinner, the barely contained certainty of a man who believes he's already won, and the cracking composure of a man encountering something outside his control. He handles all three without any of them overwhelm the scene's surface texture, which reads correctly as a meal between two people with complicated history. It's restrained, difficult work. Aldis Hodge and the weight of doubt. James Lanier could have been a simple role, the supportive male figure who doesn't quite believe the protagonist until he does. Hodge plays James with a quality of moral seriousness that makes his doubt genuinely costly rather than casually dismissive. When James doubts Cecilia, in the scene after the email, in the visit to the psychiatric ward, Hodge communicates that doubt as something James himself is uncomfortable with. The scene where James finally tells Cecilia he believes her is, in Hodge's hands, the expression of a man who has done the hard work of revisiting his own certainty and found it wanting. There's no dramatic pivot, no gesture that announces the change. He just looks at her differently. The quality of his attention shifts from the careful, worried regard of someone managing a person in crisis to the clear eyed attention of someone listening to a person who knows exactly what they're talking about. It's a small shift, it changes everything. Christian Ghazal and the editor's art. The editing of The Invisible Man is among the least discussed but most significant craft contributions to the film's effectiveness, and editor Christian Ghazal deserves considerable credit for the specific rhythms that make the experience of watching it so unusually sustained. The fundamental challenge of editing this film was time. Specifically, how long to hold. The film's strategy of using empty frames and prolonged shots to generate dread only works if the duration is precisely calibrated. Hold too short and the frame doesn't have time to develop its charge. Hold too long and the tension releases into anticlimax or unintentional comedy. The film holds exactly as long as it needs to. Not a second less, not a second more. And that precision is editorial. Ghazal's cutting rhythm in the first act is noticeably slower than contemporary horror norms. Scenes breathe, conversations are allowed to develop their own natural pacing, rather than being cut for efficiency. This establishes a baseline. This is how the film moves, this is the rhythm you're watching, that makes the second act's escalations feel more alarming by contrast. The pacing doesn't speed up dramatically in the second act, but the content within the established rhythm becomes denser, more threatening, and the unchanged cutting speed creates a specific tension. Everything is moving faster than the film's tempo, and the film refuses to accommodate that acceleration. Cutting for POV. The editing's most important structural commitment is its maintenance of Cecilia's point of view. The film, with one or two very brief exceptions, never cuts to a perspective that Cecilia doesn't share. We don't see Adrian preparing his plans. We don't see Tom complicit in the scheme. We don't see any of the events of the film from outside Cecilia's experiential position. This is an editorial choice, as much as a directorial one. Ghazal and Whannell agreed to stay locked in Cecilia's perspective. Absolutely. Even when a cut to an external view would have clarified story information more efficiently. The reason is the film's central argument. The moment you cut to Adrian's perspective, show him in the suit, planning, executing, you've given the audience information Cecilia doesn't have. You've elevated the audience above her. And in a film that's fundamentally about the experience of having your perception dismissed, of knowing something you can't prove, of being trapped in the gap between your knowledge and what you can verify, that elevation would be a betrayal of the form. The audience needs to be in Cecilia's position, not above it. It's unsettling in a specific way. For 3 or 4 seconds, you're looking at Cecilia from the perspective of the thing hunting her, and Ghazal cuts out of it before it settles into comfort, before you can locate yourself in it. The cutaway is timed to the exact moment of maximum disorientation. Watched in isolation, any single scene in this stretch might seem underdeveloped. In the editing, they compound. Ghazal's approach to this section is to establish rhythmic variety within a consistent overall tempo. Short scenes, a moved key, a turned painting, sit next to longer, more developed ones. The coffee shop, the dinner, the short scenes keep momentum without accelerating the pace, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's what the editing achieves. Not just efficiency of storytelling, but the structural mimicry of the psychological experience it depicts. In the final moments, the cutting nearly stops. The last scene holds, breathes. The image of Cecilia walking becomes an image that the film simply keeps, doesn't rush past, doesn't annotate with a rapid cut to something else. The duration of this final shot is the editor's last statement about Cecilia Kass. She's been moved through the film by the editing, by the cuts that pushed the story forward, that accelerated tension, that withheld resolution. The final held shot is the editing stepping back, giving her space, letting her move at her own speed, in her own direction, without the machinery of the narrative driving her forward. She walks, The film holds, the screen fades, and the held duration, longer than comfort requires, longer than convention dictates, is the film's parting gift to its protagonist. Room to move. Finally, simply, completely, room to move. Every horror film is about something other than what it appears to be about. The Shining is about alcoholism and the violence it breeds in families. The kind that operates in ordinary spaces, between ordinary people, using the specific vulnerabilities of love and trust as leverage points. The kind that doesn't leave marks anyone can see. The kind that makes the person experiencing it look to everyone around them like the unstable one. That's not a new subject for horror, but the particular precision with which this film anatomizes it, the structural intelligence of its argument, the way its formal choices mirror its thematic concerns, elevates it from social commentary into genuine art. And understanding what it's saying fully requires sitting with a few of its central ideas in more depth than the plot analysis allows. Gaslighting as a cinematic subject. The term gaslighting comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind, dimming the gas lights in their house and then denying they've changed when she notices the difference. It's entered common usage as shorthand for a specific pattern of psychological manipulation, making someone doubt their own perceptions, memories, and judgments through persistent denial, misdirection, and distortion of external reality. What Whannell understood and what makes his film more than a simple allegory is that gaslighting works because it exploits something fundamental about how human beings verify reality. We confirm our perceptions through other people. We trust our senses, but we trust them more when someone else corroborates them. Adrian doesn't just make Cecilia doubt herself. He corrupts the social verification system. He walks through institutions, the medical system, the legal framework, the police that are supposed to provide independent reality checks. And by corrupting those checks, by ensuring that every system Cecilia turns to reflects his version of events back at her, he creates an environment of total epistemic isolation. She knows what she knows, and there is nowhere to take that knowledge where it will be received as valid. The film makes this argument not through dialogue or exposition, but through structure. Every scene in the second act is a demonstration of a different node in the verification network failing. James, Emily, the doctors, the police, each of them separately and through no malice of their own, arriving at conclusions that serve Adrian's design. It's a systemic argument embedded in the film's architecture. It's saying that power, money, expertise, social standing, the specific advantages that accumulate around a certain kind of successful man, functions like a suit of invisibility. It allows the abuse to happen without leaving traces. It ensures that when the person being abused speaks about their experience, the system looks for the abuser and finds nothing. And her primary act of resistance, maintained across the entire film, is simply continuing to trust what she knows even when every social and institutional signal tells her not to. That's a different kind of heroism than the genre usually asks for. It's quieter, it's less legible as heroism from the outside. Cecilia doesn't look like a hero for most of the film. She looks like a frightened woman having a series of breakdowns. The heroism is internal, maintained in the face of sustained external invalidation, and it's only visible to the audience because the film has been rigorous about keeping us in her perspective. The physical one was almost secondary. The film's timeliness, and why that's complicated. The Invisible Man was released into a specific cultural moment. 3 years into the Me Too conversations, reshaping of public discourse about gender, power, and the specific patterns of abuse that hide behind wealth and reputation. It would be reductive to say the film is a You Me Too movie, but it would be dishonest to pretend the cultural context is irrelevant. What the film contributes to that conversation is formal rather than rhetorical. It doesn't argue, it demonstrates. It puts you inside the experience of being a woman whose reality is systematically invalidated by a man with more social power than she has, and it keeps you there for 2 hours without the comfort of an authoritative perspective that confirms your experience as real. The film is doing what the best politically engaged art does, not persuading you of a position, but making you feel the position from the inside. The timing also gave the film a kind of cultural longevity that a different release window might not have. Audiences brought specific, often personal frames of reference to it. women who had experienced versions of what Cecilia experiences, not with invisibility suits, but with the institutional disbelief, the social invalidation, the precise targeting of relationships and credibility. Recognize the film not as horror fantasy, but as horror realism. That recognition is part of why it hit as hard as it did, and why the conversation around it exceeded what you'd expect from a Blumhouse genre picture. The legacy, what the film changed. In the 5 years since its release, The Invisible Man has staked out a clear position in the conversation about what horror can do when it's operating at its best. It demonstrated, alongside films like Get Out, Hereditary, and Midsommar, that the genre is capable of carrying genuine intellectual and political weight without sacrificing its effectiveness as horror. That these two things, the social argument and the visceral experience, are not in tension. That the most frightening horror is often the kind that uses genre mechanics to bring you into direct contact with something true about the world you live in. It also demonstrated the specific viability of Blumhouse's low-budget, director-driven model for material of this ambition. A 7 million film that grosses 144 million and generates a genuine cultural conversation doesn't just prove a business model. It argues for a philosophy of filmmaking. Give talented people real creative freedom, and the resource constraint itself can become generative. The limitation isn't just endured, it's used. Moss's performance remains one of the defining screen portrayals of trauma and resilience in recent cinema. It's been cited by acting teachers, film critics, and survivors advocates as an example of how to portray the interior experience of abuse with specificity and honesty, without the melodrama that so often distorts it. That it exists inside a studio horror film, commercially released, broadly accessible, not sequestered in art house distribution, is part of its value. It reached people who wouldn't have sought out a small independent drama about domestic abuse. The genre was the delivery mechanism. The film proved him as a genuine author, not just a genre craftsman. The final question. The film ends, as we've discussed, with Cecilia walking away, toward the camera, across the causeway, out of the frame, moving forward. The image stays with you, and the question it leaves behind, the question that is, I'd argue, the film's real final statement, is not about what Cecilia did. It's about what the world did, what every institution, every system, every well meaning person in her life did when they encountered the reality she was trying to report. They didn't believe her, not because they were bad people, not because the system was corrupt. It's just the ability to choose which direction you're walking.